My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a Senior Consultation Specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. And with me today is my usual co host, Jennifer Ashawazagai Pereira, my colleague and an Indigenous Engagement and Traditional Knowledge Specialist at Atkins Realis. Jennifer is a member of Henvey Inlet First Nation, which is located on the French River south of Sudbury, and works with me on our projects across Canada. Hello, Jen. How are you today?
Good day, Anine. I am good. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks. Busy day for you and I. It's just one of those days, as we were talking about before. Um, but today we're going to talk about the aquatic habitat studies that we're doing as part of the environmental and impact assessments. So let's get started. We'll go run through, I guess we'll start things off by running through our second slide here, which is explains the topics for today. So we're gonna start off with talking about the objectives of the aquatic habitat field studies. We're going to talk about what will be studied. Then we're going to get into the specific activities associated with the field surveys, including fish habitat assessment, conventional fish capture, and benthic invertebrate sampling. Then we're going to talk about criteria and indicators, and potential mitigation methods, and then finally wrap up with how you can get in contact with us. So, with that, let's talk a little bit about the study objectives. So, as with the objectives of some of the other studies that are done, again, we're trying to establish a baseline. And we're doing the first two things are to identify and consider the impacts of the project on aquatic habitat, and then identify and consider the impacts of aquatic habitat on the project. And then in a general sense, we'll be providing recommendations for, or not in a general sense, but in a specific sense, providing recommendations for minimizing those negative environmental, health, or social project constructability or economic effects related to aquatic habitat impacts during construction and operation and maintenance of the actual road. In terms of what we're going to study, we're going to look at a number of different things. We're going to look at habitat availability. And so when we talk about habitat availability, we talk about both habitat quantity and habitat quality. And habitat quantity, it's when we look at that, we're doing what you call a quantitative assessment. So your quantitative means numbers, right? So we're looking at changes in numbers, and so the question might be, well, what numbers? Well, we look at the project, we look at the land and water that it travels over, and then we look at what habitats are impacted, whether they're terrestrial, meaning on land, or aquatic habitat, water. So that's what we're talking about. So we would look at for example, the footprint of the project when it's completed, during construction, and identify what areas would be impacted, what habitats might be lost based on the permanent, um, what's built permanently as opposed to what's built on a temporary basis. We also look at habitat quality, and we look at this in a qualitative way, meaning not with numbers. So we're looking at changes to the quality of spawning areas, rearing areas, so where the young are taken care of, or overwintering habitats for different species that are important, like brook trout, northern pike, walleye, lake sturgeon. And We consider other species that may not be what you call criteria species, but species that are regularly consumed or or used or harvested by community members. So these could be
like
lake
pickerel.
whitefish, pickerel, yeah, pickerel, perch, cisco, burbot, sucker, longnose sucker, white sucker, lake chub, and then we also look at habitat sensitivity. When we talk about sensitivity, we talk about rating each water body with a descriptor, right? With a like calling it rare, high, moderate, low, or no fish habitat. So we're describing the fish habitat based on its sensitivity, its dependence, the how much the different fish species depend on their habitat, how rare certain types of habitat are, and the ability of certain habitat to recover from change, right? So if it's very sensitive, it may be hard to recover from even temporary impacts to it. So we'll also be looking at fish communities, and this refers to the species and distribution of fish within a water body. When we use words like abundance, we're talking about impacts on population, um, on the numbers, right? On the numbers of different species. So mortality, meaning death of individuals resulting from activities related to the project, the construction or operation of the project, or direct or and indirect changes of the population to the population, changes to the availability of that habitat. If it's less available, that particular habitat, then that may affect the survival and reproduction of that specific species. And then we talk about distribution, and this relates to uh, we call it the spatial configuration. So that's different things. The area over which that species is distributed, right? The area over which it exists. When we talk about configuration, it could talk about how connective these areas, how connected to each other these different fish habitat areas are. That's another part of distribution. So distribution, we use a qualitative, a descriptive sort of assessment of changes that may have occurred to the distribution through direct or indirect changes to fish or to habitat or fish abundance. So again, looking at impacts of the project, see if it affects the distribution of different species. We look at spawning. That's another important area.
Hmm.
Spawning. We look at effects of spawning activity on the spawning activity of the fish, and then the extent of spawning habitat present in the project area. So we do surveys to identify the spawning areas. Hopefully, the water crossing areas where for the road are away from these spawning areas. That's hopefully the intention, and because we want to limit direct and indirect impacts on spawning areas because these are very important areas, particularly for certain species. And then
That's right.
last but
Fairly
not
sensitive.
least, yeah, very sensitive, yes. And then last but not least, we have benthic invertebrates, Jen, and I know this is one of your favorite topics. Um, these are little
That I
little
had to look
bugs.
up prior.
So benthic invertebrates are little spineless bugs, and I know Tony will want to jump in because I called them spineless, but I'm not trying to insult benthic invertebrates. I just mean they have no spine. That's why they're called invertebrates. So these little
And
guys are aquatic creatures or bugs that live at the bottom of water. They don't get a lot of credit. These guys, they're down there in
except
the bottom. Go ahead, Jen.
they're doing the hard work down there. There's
They're doing the
just
hard
wanted to
work
add
down
that
there. And
snails
go
and
ahead.
worms, and then larvae like dragonflies and beetles. And dragonflies, as you know, are very important in the spring. Everyone is so happy to see the dragonflies when they come out because they are the heroes after blackfly season.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, and the thing about benthic invertebrates and the reason why they are sampled so extensively in aquatic habitat surveys is because they're very good indicators of ecosystem health because they respond to changes in the environment. So they're that sort of indicator, right? The canary in a coal mine, as they describe that. So they provide good indicators of ecosystem productivity and health. So when they look at benthic invertebrates, they look at the number of different species, so
Concentration.
diversity, and then yeah, and abundance, right? How many of different species. So if you get a very sort of diverse group of species and a high abundance of each species in your samples of benthic invertebrates, it usually indicates a very, very healthy sort of aquatic ecosystem. So these are extremely important little guys, and that's why that work to collect those samples is such a big part of aquatic habitat surveys. So moving on now to talk about the studies themselves, there's the fish habitat assessment part, and this is more descriptive. So what we try to do in this case is characterize the water courses that we're looking at where the crossings occur. So we identify the name, the watershed that they sit within, the temperature. So we take physical measurements at where the crossing is of temperature, flow rate, velocity. We do measurements of the channel to understand the physical characteristics of the channel. So there's different measurements associated with that. Um, we measure the depth of the water course at the crossing location, the gradient of the stream. What I mean by that is really the slope of the stream. So it's usually measured in percentage, but it just the rate at which the elevation changes along the stream. And then they make observations on the riparian vegetation, any barriers such as beaver dams to fish passage. So another one of the approaches for the fish studies is conventional fish capture, and so the fish community sampling is conducted to determine the species present and how many there are at that sampling point. So this is done typically, in the areas where the water crossings would occur, and they use different ways of capturing fish, whether it's hoop nets or angling, like actually fishing, seine nets, minnow traps, or they use electrofishing as well too, which is where you put a current through the water and the animals are sort of are briefly immobilized and they float to the surface and then they're netted, weighed and measured and then released again. So um, there's different approaches to fish capture, and it's a
Hmm.
fairly effective way of understanding fish communities, but there's a newer kind of or a newish kind of tool that's being used now on projects, and it's called eDNA sampling, and what that involves is taking a water sample basically, and then having all the DNA in that sample analyzed to identify what was in that sample. So you get an idea of different species at different stages. So this is becoming a
Oh,
really
that's neat.
popular. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I've seen this in action, and it's pretty interesting. And so,
And
as you can imagine,
it's not
Jen,
intrusive.
no, it's not. That's one of
I
the
like
more
that. Then
popular things about it, right?
you get to know everybody in the neighborhood.
Yes, yeah, that's a good way to describe it. And so you get an idea from these samples about species richness, right? The number of species in a given area at a given time. And because what you do is you take that sample, then it's filtered to separate the DNA. Then the DNA goes off to the lab and is then analyzed. And based on the sequencing of the DNA, they can identify the specific species of organism. That's
Wow. It's like water
so it's pretty
CSI.
amazing. Yeah, water CSI. That's exactly it. Yeah. So, um, this has turned out to be a pretty effective way of getting a better idea in combination, with conventional fish capture as well,
Hmm.
and electrofishing, other techniques. But um,
Yeah, because
it's
the other way
being used.
you get to know the ages and kind of relative size of the fish.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Because when you're
Exactly.
looking at
That's
a
right.
DNA sample, you can't tell some of those things. So it's nice to have all of those opportunities to have a really good picture of what's in the water communities.
You got it. So you're at that location, you're taking a water sample from the water column, right? So right in situ, right in the water, you take that sample and then you get a snapshot of what was there at the time. And then you do that at a number of different locations. You get a pretty good idea. You do it over different seasons. You get an idea of what's going on. And then you combine that with the conventional fish capture. You get that pretty good picture of like it allows you to define that pretty strong baseline actually. Um,
Hmm.
and then there's the benthic invertebrate sampling. We'll go back to your favorite
Here we
topic, Jen, benthic
benthic
invertebrates.
invertebrates. I like saying
Yes,
that.
yes.
Benthic
Fun to say that, yeah.
invertebrates.
So
I
again, these are
learned
these are
something
little
new
bugs.
today.
These are little spineless bugs, and the reason why they are sampled, as I mentioned before, is because they're good indicators of ecosystem health. And so the way it's typically done is they use a thing called a ponar, which, if you can imagine, is like a uh, two scoops on either side, and
Like a
they're
claw? Is it like a
triggered
claw thing?
like a claw. So they're triggered to close when they hit something. So what they do is they drop this down on a rope, for example, and then it hits the bottom of the river or lake, and then closes, and then closes closes up, and then hopefully you've got a pretty good grab of mud, and then you pull that back up and dump it in a bucket, and then those samples get sent off to labs, and then the experts in benthic invertebrates pick through the samples and identify a certain number of take a certain number of individual benthic invertebrates and identify them to species, which is not easy work. It's very detailed work because there's sometimes very subtle differences between the different kinds of bugs that you get, and then um, they count how many of each species they find, and then they use that to generate what's called a diversity index, which provides sort of an idea to technical people as to ecosystem health. So that's basically how that works. Now, with the aquatic habitat studies, the valued components are fish habitat and fish and aquatic species, including species at risk. Now, remember, the valued components are the things that are studied, that are
Hmm.
important, have been identified as being important, right? And then you have indicators associated with the valued components. So the different fish species that that we're looking at, among others, as part of this work, is walleye, brook trout, northern pike, lake whitefish, burbot, yellow perch, common white sucker, lake sturgeon, lake chub, as well. And so when we look at the indicators, so the indicators are measures, right? Ways of indicating. You have to do measures in order to be able to see if there's impacts, right? So indicators could include habitat quantity, the distribution or connectivity to habitat and migration, because again, some species move a lot, right? At different, depending on their stage of life.
Hmm.
Um, there's, it gives, so survival, reproduction, and abundance are again indicators of fish and aquatic species. And then there's the habitat side of things where we look at water quality, right? We take a water sample at where the water crossing would be, which is where the impact would be to the water course because the road is crossing it. We look at the physical habitat conditions. We look at the benthic invertebrate community. So those are the indicators. Those are the ways of measuring potential impacts. Now, as we get close to the end here, there's the hopeful side of things, which is the potential mitigation methods. Because even though there may be impacts from projects, there are known mitigation methods, and these mitigation methods are identified quite early in the process, and then they get refined over time and much more specific, and then end up being taking the form of commitments and monitoring requirements to ensure that what was anticipated in terms of impacts isn't a surprise, and that
Mm-hmm.
all efforts are being made to limit those impacts. Again, that's what mitigation means, right? Limiting those impacts. So that could take a number of different methods. So a number of different approaches. So, for example, you could look at different alternative locations for gravel pits and quarries, and for other facilities, like if um, maybe a construction camp's been identified to be placed in a certain area, but it might be too close to a water course that's sensitive habitat for a particular species. Then maybe you might want to move the construction camp to another location, right? So all these things are sort of kept in mind. Um, you can, when it comes to watercourse crossings, you want to design them to adapt to climate change, where maybe flow rates might be increased. They're because events, rainfall events might be more extreme than previously.
Mm-hmm.
So you might, end up with a design for a culvert that's bigger than maybe what you need based on current weather patterns, but you don't want to cause damage down the road where the culvert might blow out, right? So you put in a larger culvert to accommodate for climate change. And then other techniques that you see all the time, Jen, on when you're driving along the highway or whatever, is the use of stone, like riprap type stone, or sometimes armor stone. It depends on whether you're talking about lakes or rivers or whatever, to mitigate erosion, right? To prevent erosion. So around the inlets or outlets of pipes, like culverts, you'll see them lined with stone to prevent that soil loss from getting into the watercourse and affecting aquatic habitat. And then you could also design watercourse crossings to allow fish passage to be easier, and like open bottom culverts, things like that that are more fish friendly. So those are some potential mitigation methods. Other ones could be using different toppings for the road, different embankment material, designing the road in a different way in terms of its geometry, so that it could handle increases in rainfall intensity, different grading techniques, so different ways of shaping the road to minimize soil loss or erosion, and designing the road with a grade to allow proper surface drainage. So just basically proper design, engineering
Mm-hmm.
design. So yeah, lots of ways, Jen, to mitigate impacts on aquatic habitat. Um, and again, as I said, they get refined as time goes on, right? Because as we get a better understanding of the baseline, we get a better understanding as to how to
I
prevent
have a
things.
question, Don.
Sure, sure.
So, how long do we undertake these water studies to capture a really good baseline?
Well, that's a great question, Jen. So typically you'll do this over multiple years, multiple
Mm-hmm.
seasons, right? Because you're trying to get that snapshot. So I know on other projects we've done them for 3 years, over multiple seasons, just so that we can get that indication of what's going on. Because you never know, one year might be an anomaly, right? It might be very different
Might
from
be
what's gone
dry,
on in the
or
past.
right,
Yeah,
or we
yeah,
might
yeah,
have more
exactly.
precipitation than normal. Yeah,
So
there's so
that's why
many
you do
different
multiple
factors,
years,
right?
right? Yeah, yeah. So you do multiple years to get a better picture and have more confidence in your baseline, basically. Wow, that
Okay.
was a lot of material to cover in a short period of time, wasn't
It,
it, Jen?
it was. You had a lot to
Whew.
say. And
Yeah,
I
yeah,
learned
that was
about
a that
benthic
was a
invertebrates today.
yeah. Don't forget that there'll be a quiz on the radio show this afternoon
Oh
on
no.
benthic invertebrates. Yeah, get ready. Start studying.
Dragonfly
So that
larvae.
so that wraps up today's discussion of the aquatic habitat studies. We hope this was helpful and encourages you to join us again next week when we discuss the greenhouse gases and air quality studies. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, northernroadlink.ca. Miigwech, and make sure to look out for project updates on social media and our website.
All right. Chimigwech, Bamapi.